own culture online, which I didn't even know I was really putting myself into. I just thought it sounded cool, which, maybe it does. It was originally going to be Cosmic Critic, but I'm glad I changed it. I interviewed a man called William Lane Craig, who's a wonderful and prolific Christian philosopher. He edited the Black Belt Companions to Natural Theology, and he was really engaged in the New Atheism debates. And I had him on my podcast, and originally when I sent the invitation, he nearly refused on the grounds that he thought I was a cosmic skeptic, as in one of these Pyrrhonian skeptics who won't make any sort of positive claims about the world at all. And I actually think that that's probably one of the main problems with skepticism, the skeptical approach, is that it's one of the easiest things that a person can do. It's easy as it gets to poke holes in other people's worldviews, and this is why skeptical and reactionary movements do so well and garner such support, because it sounds so rational, it sounds so awesome. It's like you have this huge structure in front of you and you can just poke holes in it and tear it down, but it's relatively easy to do. Look at the way that New Atheism is now talked about in the past tense. You notice this? I don't know if anybody follows the New Atheism thing or is really interested in it here, but people talk about what New Atheism was as if it's a historical movement. Why is that the case? I mean, arguably there was nothing new about New Atheism in the first place. The thing that was really new was that it was showmanship, it was rhetoric. But what the New Atheists were great at doing was tearing other people down, tearing other people's worldviews down, and they did it wonderfully. The problem that we're beginning to see is that if you don't erect a positive vision in its place, then, and look, it's not necessarily the job of a skeptic to do that. I mean, maybe somebody's better at diagnosing things than they are at providing solutions. A lot of philosophers are like that. But the problem is that if there is nothing in response, then your movement ends up leaving a lot to be desired and kind of begins to fall apart at the seams. There's a lot of talk about whether atheism in general requires a burden of proof. There's this idea that it's a passive position. The religious people are making the claims, and the skeptic is the person who just, does the criticism and doesn't need to justify their position. I'm not so sure that this is the case for a few reasons. First is that skepticism is not a position, and it's not synonymous with something like atheism. If I invited you to sort of Skepticon, like one of these conferences or something, I said it's going to be this huge skeptical conferences of open-minded people challenging ideas. Would you be surprised if I showed you the lineup and it was all Christians? Like, maybe, probably, I would be. Even though that doesn't really make much sense, because you kind of would presume that it's going to be a bunch of atheists. Skepticism is talked about as a synonym of atheism, but that's clearly not the case, and that's a big problem. Skepticism is obviously supposed to be a method here, but that's how people treat it. The problem is, what skeptics like to do is they like to say, I make sure that all of my positions are based on evidence and reason and rationality. I'm not going to believe something because some ancient scripture or imaginary sky daddy tells me so. No, I base it on reason and evidence. But famously, this is impossible to actually live out to the fullest degree. Everybody has viewpoints and opinions, and in fact, foundational axiological assumptions which cannot be proved, even in principle. Famously, things like the external world. It's impossible to prove that the external world exists, and people are perfectly happy to just accept that, well, look, we can't really get anywhere without believing in the external world. Sure, if you want to sort of lay around in your Cartesian hellhole, then you can do that, but you're not going to get anywhere. Fine, but bear in mind that there are many people who think the same thing as belief in God. Famously, Jordan Peterson has done a lot for popularising this idea that, well, look, you might think you're living like an atheist, but you're not really. Now, whether or not you think that's true, I think it's a little bit dubious at best. It does mean that we at least need to reevaluate this claim that we only believe things that are based on argument and reason. That can't be the case. You believe in the external world, you believe in the existence of other minds, you believe in induction. And you might say, well, technically, no, I don't. Technically, I'm an agnostic. But if you were truly agnostic about these things, if you were genuinely 50-50 about induction, for example, anybody who's done philosophy here, or is doing philosophy, will probably be familiar with the problem of induction. So it's somewhat complicated to really get to grips with, but it can be summed up, I guess, in the idea that, one example of induction is belief that the laws of physics will continue working. So there's no way that we can know that gravity won't just stop working in 5 minutes. And so, and David Hume, I think, quite compellingly shows that there's literally no way that we can even justify the probability of this kind of thing. If you don't believe me, go and look it up, it's fascinating. But the thing is, if you really were genuinely agnostic about it, genuinely on the fence, then you'd have no better reason, if you wanted to ask me a question, to put your hand up, to stand up, and to try and use your vocal cords than you would to try and do a backflip through that window. If you really didn't think, you have no idea if the laws of physics are going to be working in the way that they were 5 minutes ago, that I even exist right now, if you really didn't know that, then you wouldn't behave in the way that you do. So there's definitely some wisdom in this idea that what somebody believes is best found out, even by their own selves, by how they behave. If somebody tells you that they're not superstitious at all, but then you find them saluting a magpie, or avoiding walking under a perfectly safe ladder or something, you might have reason to think that they're a bit more suspicious than even they realise. Now, this is a big mistake that I think people make, and I'm sorry to steal the quote that we were going to use in the Q&A section. C.S. Lewis was brilliant when he said, as he so often does, characteristically does, when he said that the purpose of philosophy should not be cutting down forests, but irrigating deserts. Of course, you have to make room for the new positions to grow, but scepticism is not supposed to be a tool of destruction. It's supposed to be a tool of auditioning new ideas and new ways of approaching the world when you're trying to construct a worldview. Because if you're not doing that, then all you end up doing is tearing things down. And sure, you can do that if you like, but it's not going to leave you anywhere worth being. What's the point in doing philosophy? I guess there are two broad reasons people do it. One is because they want to know how the world really is. One is because they want to know how to live. And all of the philosophers that have stuck with us in our memory, all of the philosophers that mean something to people, the philosophers that people have posters on their bedrooms, are more in the latter category. They tell them how to live, they tell them what to do. You listen to their philosophical musings, and you end up changing the way that you live. If you don't, what's the point? There's a great exam question about ethics. I think it was in ethics that said something like, does studying ethics make you a more moral person? And if not, what's the point? What is the point in doing that? It would be like studying woodwork, but not getting better at doing carpentry. What would be the point in doing that? It seems like we need to be actually doing something that's going to tell us how we're going to live our lives. Look, there's lots more to say. To be frank, I don't even know how long I've been talking already, but I actually really think it'd be great to just get into it, to just talk to these chaps over here and then open it up to Q&A, because I just want to have a conversation with you all, and there's so many of you, and it's wonderful, so I want to get through as many of you as possible. So I guess there it is, skepticism. Didn't so much do the meaning part, but that's a pretty tall order. Perhaps we'll get to it in Q&A, I don't know, but we'll see. Thanks, I'm going to sit down now, but we'll carry this on. Ethical emotivism, at least of the form that Ayer popularised. There are other forms of non-cognitivism. The kind of thing that the thing that's interesting about emotivism for ethics is that really it's a theory of language rather than a theory of ethics. It says what people mean when they say things are good or bad. And the interesting thing about emotivism is it removes the truth value of ethical claims. It's not to say that they're false, it's to say that they can't be true or false. Because an expression going yay can't be true or false. And this is a problem for people. What happens then to ethical deliberation? Surely we can have meaningful debates. We see it all the time. People argue all the time about things. What's going on? I mean, the first thing to note, as Ayer does in chapter 7, Language, Truth and Logic, which is where he deals with this. Because this is kind of a side note for Ayer, by the way. He's talking about broad ethical, broad philosophical worldview, and this is just like a side chapter, but probably the most memorable part of the book. The way he deals with it is to point out, for a start, that most ethical debate is not ethical debate. When people have ethical debates, they're not discussing anything moral, they're discussing descriptive claims. Look at a debate about, gun control in America. Look at a debate about abortion. What are people saying? They're saying, well, the prefrontal cortex develops at this stage. Well, don't you know that if we illegalize semi-automatic weapons, the deaths would drop by this number? Oh, don't you know that more people are killed by swimming pools? It's statistics, it's fact. None of these are moral claims, they're just descriptive claims. They're just claims about things that are true and false about the world. What's the moral element? The moral element about, whether we have the right to engage in things which might kill other people. That's an interesting moral question, but that's rarely actually the bit that gets addressed. So the kind of moral deliberation that people think obviously happens, how the hell could you say that people are incapable of morally debating? If that's what ethics is, then they can't deliberate. It's because most of the time they're not ethically deliberating, they're deliberating on matters of fact.
And I think the emotions would have to say that if they ever are actually getting to the moral point, that it is essentially just an expression of emotion. And I think it kind of has to be. I mean, how else do you solve these problems? When you're talking about utilitarianism, when you learn about utilitarianism, it's the first thing that people point out. They say, it's attractive to people who think about ethics the first time. Utilitarianism is one of the first things they come across. Oh, that makes sense, yeah, great scope of greatest number. And what do people say? They act. But have you thought about the fact that if you're okay with maximising good for the maximal number of people, what if an innocent person walks into a hospital and 5 people need an organ transplant? Should we be able to kill that person, to take their organs and save those 5 people? And everyone goes, oh, an interesting critique of utilitarianism. Who the hell said that's a critique? That may be an implication. I mean, maybe it's not an implication of utilitarianism, fine, but say that it were. Say that we knew that, yeah, if utilitarianism is true, you should kill innocent people to